Greetings, intrepid explorers of obsolete cassette technology. In this video, I'm going to be presenting a review of this hefty beast, the Tascam 488 Portastudio. It's an 8-track cassette recorder with an integrated mixer. Although I will be discussing numbers of inputs and outputs and all this kind of business, it's a powerful but very complicated mixer, and for that reason I have filmed quite long and detailed user guide, a walkthrough of the mixer. So if you've come to this video because you own one of these and you're not quite sure how to use it, do refer to that video. I'll put the link to it in the description of this one. I'm also planning to do a demo recording where I will probably focus on the creative aspects and gloss over the connections a little bit, but that might be worth seeing. You can hear the end result if you want to know what the sound's like. I've already done a series of videos on how to tear this down, so if you own one or are thinking about buying one and you want to repair it yourself, then there's some reconnaissance on the deconstruction of that. Again, I'll put that link in the description. But yeah, if just finding out a little bit more about it, what else was on the market when it came out, what it can do, how it compares to other 8-tracks, then stick around. I'll run the introduction and we'll get right into it. Before I start, just for reference, where's my information about this coming from? A couple of sources. One of which is the user manual, another of which is the service manual. I've got quite a lot of experience with this already, using it, recording with it. I've fixed them before, torn them down before. But the other main source is that there is a review dated to 1991 of this unit from Sound and Sound magazine that's archived on their website. So I will put a link to that down in the description if you'd like to hear their take on this machine and what they thought of it, how they listed the features. So let's begin with the timing of this. Since this was reviewed in 1991, I've got to assume that that is when it entered the market in the United Kingdom. Now, whether it got an earlier release in Japan or the United States, I just don't know. The retail price of it when it was released in the United Kingdom was £999. I used the Bank of England's inflation calculator, and as of today, which is end of August in 2022, that is equivalent to £1,855 in today's money, which is equivalent to $2,550 US dollars. I like to put the price of these things in because, one of my ongoing headaches as a guy that's an administrator on a Facebook page about this technology is that you constantly see people complaining about the prices that these fetch. Like, this cost me, when it was broken, £80. I'm probably going to sell it and I might get £300 for it. That's as somebody who can present this as service because of my experience. So £300 as a proportion of £1,855. I mean, I'm not going to do the maths, but that represents an enormous amount of devaluation. That means some poor bugger who bought this new effectively lost £1,500 in Great British pounds somewhere along the line. Put that in context. At the time that this came out, you could get DAT machines and so on, which were very expensive, but you couldn't use your laptop to record an album the way you can now. So that's why it was priced at that level. Now, whether that is still a fair representation of value, given the other options available to us, affordable 8-track digital recorders, the ability to add recording facilities to things like iPads, which we might have in contract and almost feel like we're getting them for free. Well, that's for you to weigh up. I don't personally feel that the kind of prices I've been buying and selling these for are extortionate. Obviously, at that price, we are pointing towards the high end of the market. I mean, I don't know what proportion of the average person's annual income equivalent to £1,855 is, but I've got to assume it's like at least 1 month's wages, if not 2 months' wages, if you spent nothing else. This would have been pitched at pretty serious musicians. Like, I guess if you got a record deal and you wanted to demo shit, then you might get the record company to buy you one of these or a 688. I mean, there's a famous image doing the rounds of Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins buying a 688. But, it's fairly serious, fairly professionally minded people that Tascam were pitching this at. And it's got the feature set to go with that. I'll come to that in a minute. According to the Sound and Sound article, this was preceded by the 688. Tascam. So I guess that the 688, that makes it the first cassette 8-track ever produced. I don't know the exact date of that. I had a look about for the release date of Yamaha's competitor, the MT8X, and apparently that didn't arrive until 1994, some 3 years later. So this is the second unit to market ever to split a cassette into these tiny little 0.25 of a millimeter wide is the section on the cassette that actually contains the information. And despite that very small range, we've got 90 decibels of dynamic range with the DBX on. There's 70 decibels difference between adjacent tracks for the bleed. We've got a 14 kilohertz bandwidth. So, you know, I mean, it's quite technically impressive. I mean, it's worse from a technical point of view than a digital recorder, obviously, or than a reel-to-reel player. And I think the dynamic range there is narrower than it is for 4-track. So I think the frequency range is equivalent. I would have to look that up. Maybe I'll put that information on screen. But yeah, I mean, pretty technically impressive. Better than you might think, better than the critics might assume. This is using double tape speed, so if I've got this pitch control here set at 12 o'clock, then the tape player is going to be revolving at 3 3/4 inches per second. That is in order to get a wider frequency range and a better, I believe it affects the dynamic range as well. I would have to check that, but certainly it's high speed tape for improved fidelity relative to like domestic cassette players that people might have had in their home stereos at the time. How heavy or portable is it? Well, I mean, I'm guessing, have I got the spec sheets in front of me? Again, if I find that, I'll put that up on the screen now. I'm guessing that's like at least £10. So, you know, I mean, I don't need an assistant in order to lift it. Would I want to lift it alongside anything else? Not really. Would I want to drop it from any height? No, because the weight of it would damage it. It's portable to the extent that, yeah, I could put it in the boot of a car probably pretty easily. If I got a largish suitcase and some padding, I could carry it around on public transport that way. I couldn't put it in a backpack and cycle with it, not really. It's more the kind of thing that's desktop. It's going to sit in one place as your sort of like semi-integrated solution for making tapes back in 1991. If we compare the features that this has to those two contemporaries that I identified, it doesn't have XLR inputs, it doesn't have phantom power, and you can only record 4 channels at once, whereas the 688 can record all 8 channels at once. There are XLR inputs and it does have phantom power. I do forget if I'm comparing it to the MT8X, is that one that you can record on all 8 tracks at the time? I can't remember. I'd need to look at my own review. That is a unit that I've torn down on this channel before. It's got a less sophisticated EQ because the MT8X also has a mid-range. But other than that, they're broadly equivalent. I think the MT8X is a bit larger in its footprint. It looks cleaner on the inside, but actually, speaking from experience, I find this easier to take apart than the MT8X. For reference, the 688 is an absolute pain in the arse to take apart because it's so complicated. It has this digital assignment of bus things, and I greatly prefer the method of bus assignment that we have on this, which is, as I said earlier, the subject of its own video. It is quite a complex unit to use, but still, it's a shallower learning curve than the 688. I think the MT8X was a little bit easier to use. It just so happens I have a 488 Mark II. When did that come out? Probably about 1995. And by that point, they've made improvements such as adding a parametric EQ. The assignment of mixer channels to record tracks is simpler. We have an XLR socket up here. It's easier access to the sockets in general. The screen is backlit rather than the slightly dim and hard to see LCD screen that we have on the 488. So there are some minor improvements that would lead me to say that if I had my choice, I would rather have the 488 Mark II over the Mark I, but I'm not really casting too much shade on this. It's a really good unit. It's really flexible. The way the heads work, I'm missing a spring in this one, but if I just trick it into thinking that there's a tape in there by pushing the switch in the top left corner that detects the cassette, you can see we've got 2 heads of arrays. The leftmost one is the erase head, and this one is both the record and the playback head. Internally, it's switching between the record and playback amplifier so that that head can serve a dual function. We've got a single pinch roller which contacts with capstan and draws the cassette across the heads at a steady speed. We do have dBX noise reduction. There is a switch on the rear, thereabouts. I'll maybe put in some B-roll showing you the switch itself. So you can turn it off, but as you can see in the screen in the bottom left corner, it says dBX. That improves the dynamic range at the expense of the high end, but you can compensate for that. So when you're tracking, you can use the high shelf EQ and turn that up, and that will go some way to take that dullness out of the sound. And I should also say that I'm personally an advocate of dBX. I like the way it sounds. It privileges the low end and the low mids in a way that I like. I mean, a lot of the time when we're trying to get like an analog sound in the digital domain, what that involves is making the hit lows quite a bit louder and making the highs a little bit less strident. dBX in combination with the sound of the cassette medium just does that out of the box, in my opinion, so I really don't have an issue with it. We can see that the buttons are sort of piano touch. They're prone to this thing where the plastic hinges break. You can see that we've got a button just rattling about in here. It's just one of the things that happens with wear and tear. But you know, underneath there is a tactile switch built into the printed circuit board. So again, if I trick this into thinking that it has a cassette in it, we can see that, you know, the counter changes in response to the position. LEDs above show what is happening. There's pause. I could even now that's got a flashing record sound here because I haven't actually armed any tracks. But yeah, you can see we've got pretty good user feedback here about the buttons. They're pretty responsive. The counter is digital. We can reset it. If I were to fast forward to a certain position, I can use this return to zero button. Let me just put an actual cassette in here. I don't know why I'm fiddling about with my finger like that. If I press return to zero, it will automatically go to zero. And if I rewind behind it as well and press return to zero, it'll line up. You know, it misses it by like, you know, one segment, so you'll be at 0001 or 9999, but it pretty much will take you back to the right place. And there's digital memory in here, so there's 2 extra locations. There's options for it to automatically repeat between those locations. You can enter rehearsal mode, where between those 2 locators, it will allow your input signal, say you're playing a guitar, to become audible through the Q bus as you listen back. So yeah, there's a lot of digital technology in here that's helpful for the person recording by themselves. It's also possible to add an external unit to punch in and punch out. I believe that you could probably use something off-brand. If you've got a switchable polarity sustain pedal for a piano, that would do the trick. Leave your hands on your instrument if you want. It's designed to be used with Type 2 cassettes, that is chrome cassettes, high bias cassettes. It is possible under the hood to change the frequency and amplitude of the bias signal that's getting onto the record head and the erase head. And in that fashion, you could, if you wanted, recalibrate it for Type 1 tape. Type 1 tape will work. You just hit tape saturation more quickly. There's more hiss and it leaves more residue on the heads. Metal tape, I don't know if that would work. I'm led to believe, although I haven't actually tested it myself, that you would have erase issues if you tried to use that tape type. While the head is split into 8 segments, 8 tracks of tape, remember that tape tracks and mixer channels are 2 different things. We can only record on 4 of them at a time. The method by which we assign an input to a tape track is quite complex, which is why I've made a whole long separate video about how to route the signal. But effectively, you can have one out of this pair, one of this pair, and one out of this pair at any given time. So you can record to track 1 or 5, but not both at the same time, etc, etc. So you can record up to 4 tracks of the cassette at a time, but bear in mind, you can record 12 inputs down to 1 tape track, or 6 inputs down to 2 tape tracks. There's a lot of flexibility in the mixer there. Your only real restriction is that you can only fill up 4 tape tracks at a time, and then you need to make a second pass in order to fill up the other 4 tape tracks. Though I appreciate that most users, most of the time, are going to be building up things maybe 1 or 2 tracks at a time. If we wanted a more more complex arrangement with even more inputs than that, there is the facility to bounce on this. We can take a copy of, let's say, 4 tracks of drums, they're on tracks 1, 2, 3, 4 of the cassette, and make a blend of those onto 2 tracks on the other side, or just one if you're happy for it to be mono. Given the 8 tracks and the facility to bounce, with a little bit of pre-planning, it's absolutely possible to do bonkers complicated arrangements on this machine. That's no problem. So the inputs, in a sense, we've got 12 of them. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 monaural 1/4 inch tip sleeve unbalanced sockets here. And then we've got 2 stereo tip ring sleeve unbalanced inputs here. Generally speaking, these are meant to be inputs for recording, and these 2 are meant to be returns for your effects signal, which I will get to in a minute. The unit does not have phantom power, so if you were to want to use a microphone, a condenser microphone that requires phantom power, you would need to have a separate preamp that was providing phantom power to the microphone, and then you would take the output of that preamp and insert it into one of these inputs. However, so long as you've got cables that terminate in a TS or TRS 1/4 inch jack plug, then it's completely possible to just use dynamic microphones straight into the unit, you know, something like an SM57 with the right cable, no problem. Outputs on this are slightly complex because we have 2 master faders. So we've got a 1-2 left-right output here on the back, that's RCA sockets, and we've also got a 3-4 output here on the back sockets. What that allows us to do is actually have 2 mixes. So we could have one mix that's going to a digital recorder and another mix that's going to, I don't know, a headphone amplifier. We don't have individual tape outs, which makes it a little bit trickier to digitize this unit because you'll get tape drift. I've got a video about that upcoming, but it's the phenomenon where little inconsistencies in the motor will make the length of your first and your second pass as you capture this into the digital domain slightly different lengths. And then what happens if you leave that, then you end up with this like natural flanging effect that can be quite cool as an effect, but it means that you would have to do some screwing around with the audio in the digital domain, like time stretching and things, in order to get the 2 WAV files that you created exactly the right length, and that compromises the quality of the audio, unfortunately. It's really the sort of machine, unless you want to dick around with lots of time stretching algorithms in a digital audio workstation, you do need to mix it in the box and just capture a stereo output from either this output or this output on the rear, and where there isn't any opportunity to further master or process the audio in the digital domain other than doing a kind of like stereo bus level compression or EQ or other mastering tasks like that. The effects system in this is fairly powerful. We've got these rotary switches, 1 per mixer channel. If you turn to the right, you're sending to effect 2. If you turn to the left, you're sending to effect 1. So it's an either or situation. You can send your effect to one of 2 effects, but not both of them at the same time. There isn't any facility to pan where the effect is separate of the position of the mixer channel. So if you wanted, say, the reverberation on your guitar to appear in a different place in the stereo image to where the dry signal was appearing in the stereo image, you would need to be relying on there being pan facilities built into your outboard gear. You would tend to send effect 1 out of the effect 1 socket, which is just up to that corner, and then it would return on the stereo inputs here. You would assign it to the correct master bus using these buttons and set the level. And so these effects send levels, that's a master level for how all the effects that are coming from all 8 of these channels, how loud they're hitting the effect unit. And the way that you can assign it is completely possible either during tracking, or during overdubbing, or during bouncing, or during mixdown to add these effects. So if you wanted to add more than 1 effect per channel, with a bit of pre-planning, you could, on the first pass, you know, tracking, add reverb. On the second pass, bouncing, add delay. And on the third pass, mixdown, knock yourself out. Go ahead and put a ring modulator on there. See if I care. Sub-mixing wise, yeah, well, we've got this situation where we can send to either of these 2 pairs of RCA sockets on the way out. We can assign any of those groups. So this is groups 1 and 2, effectively. This is groups 3 and 4 to appear in our headphone using these buttons. We can also assign cue. Cue is how we separate what you hear as a performer from what the cassette player hears as a recording device, because it may be that you want to hear that drum machine you already recorded, but you don't want to record a new copy of that drum machine onto your track along with the guitar part. These tape knobs up at the top, you turn those to the right, and what that does is it sends the signal from the tape to a cue mix, and if you turn that on, then you can hear that in your headphones. And so you would tend to use that submix facility for tracking and overdubbing. During mixdown, then we would turn these switches in the other direction, so they're in mix, and at that point what's coming off the tape player is passing through the EQ, and it's passing through the fader and the pan control, where previously it was part of the method by which we assign inputs to tape tracks, is now placing your sound in a stereo field. I don't think we actually discussed exactly what happens with the EQ here. That's 10 kilohertz and 100 hertz respectively, and we've got up to 12 decibels of cut or boost. So yeah, that's pretty powerful. We can cut out mic rumble, we can add brilliance to something like cymbals or like the high end of a piano, or if we've got an instrument like a bass guitar where effectively that is dead air, then we can cut that out. It would be nice to have a mid-range control, but maybe that's what the effects end is for. Hopefully you've got mid-range controls on some of your digital instruments and you can compensate for that. That way it's not the end of the world that there is no mid-range control there, in my opinion. Synchronisation is a possibility on this. So if you imagine back in the day when MIDI technology was a rarer thing, and how we combined that with recording was a more fraught process, just because most recording wasn't being done in the digital domain on digital audio workstations which take care of that synchronization for you. Then the dominant technology was called FSK, which is effectively you recorded almost like a SMPTE pulse code to one channel, and then that got sent via a MIDI conversion box to your MIDI gear, and in that way if you turned up the pitch control or if there was variation in the motor, then the MIDI tempo of your attached gear would respond to that. And the way that that's handled in the 488, there's a switch on the back, and when you turn on sync, there's an input and an output and RCA cables on the back there, and that information is located on track 8 of the cassette. And at that point, channel 8 of your mixer becomes redundant. So if you ever get hold of one of these and you're like, well, everything else works, but why aren't I getting any signal through onto channel 8? That's probably why. Probably sync's turned on and that's inactivated that channel. So let's talk about how easy to fix and dismantle this is. I would say not bad. If you need to get at the bottom board that has the record and playback amplifiers on it, well, it's right there. It's not one of these ones where you've got a second board on top. Effectively, the case opens like this and the mixer is attached to the top half and the record and playback amplifier, etc. is on the bottom half. So your access to trim pots for calibration is pretty good. I've worked on units that are easier in terms of dismantling and calibrating, but I've also worked on a lot of models, even from this manufacturer, which are a lot harder to work on. So there's no real complaints there. Achilles heels, well, quite often the doors will be missing and broken. This one's intact, but it doesn't have a spring on it, but you know, it keeps the dust out and the noise in, which is really the main purpose of having the door. A lot of these models use the same motor, and basically as soon as this is turned on, I mean, I don't know if that's visible at all, but if I touch that capstan pin, it's spinning as soon as it's turned on. So the motor is doing work, the regulator chip inside it is heating up the entire time that it's turned on. And so what you tend to find with this generation, 90s Fords, and I'm talking about the whole Tascam 424 family, the 464, all of these, the motors can burn out if you're not careful about like leaving the unit on when you're not using it. It can be fixed for as long as we can get hold of new old stock motor regulation chips. I've made a couple of videos about that, how you can do sort of open heart transplant surgery on the motor and bring it back to life. life. So that's one thing to be aware of. But other than that, the kind of problems they have are just run-of-the-mill problems that we have with any kind of technology like this, which is getting on for 20 years old. The grease can turn to glue, you can get grit and dirt into the faders, the electrolytic capacitors in there were really only meant to have a shelf life of 20 years. They consist of gel or liquid in a sealed barrel, and the seals aren't perfect, and the audio passing through them acts almost like friction because they're polarized components. So you can find that aging solder or an aging capacitors will occasionally mean that you have dead channels. Signal isn't getting through to parts of the mixer that you would expect it to. Because of the weight of the unit, sometimes you'll find some of the plastic mounting posts inside break. I've got videos about how to fix that. You can do that with spin welding, but it's not a bad refurbishment project. I would class this as a mid-level refurbishment project. Neither the easiest one that you could buy if you're getting into the hobby, but not the hardest one to fix up by any stretch of the imagination. Thanks for making it this far. I hope that gave you some insight into what this machine's about, what it's capable of, how it sits in the canon of other multi-track cassette recorders. If you got value out of this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel and turning on the notifications bell, because all of that stuff helps to thrust my bald head and tattooed hands into the public consciousness and helps other people like you to better understand this technology, how to fix it, how to use it, etc, etc. Furthermore, if you would like to help me, the schematics for this model and the user manual for this model are up for free download on my blog, and on that blog you will find that there is a PayPal donate button. Alternatively, you can subscribe to me on Patreon. I try and keep that really cheap. It's like $1 or £1 per month minimum. I do put exclusive content up on there. It's helpful for those of you who are deep in the hobby of trying to fix these things or almost approaching the repair of them like a side hustle. So yeah, check out those resources. There's links to all of that in the description. All that remains to say, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.